Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another Halal Metropolis community conversation. Halal Metropolis is a series of exhibitions exploring Muslim visibility in Detroit and Southeast Michigan. My name is Osman Khan and I am one of the project's curators. Tonight we will be hearing from local Muslim advocates and activists who are fighting for social justice and change through their tireless work. Our panelists today are Namira Islam Anani, who is a lawyer and a graphic designer. As a specialist in the field of human rights, education, and training, Namira works to disrupt patterns that lead to dehumanization. She believes that creativity and cross-cultural wisdom can change how we interact with one another, and that if we invest in justice by investing in people, communities, and movements. Namira is also the co-founder of the Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative, better known as Muslim ARC, an organization that trains communities on issues of racial justice. Our next panelist is Mark Crane, who is the Chief of Member Experience and a Senior Strategist at Move On, where he's led campaigns on expanding access to healthcare, preventing expanded US wars abroad, and taking down Confederate monuments. Locally, Mark leads Dream of Detroit, an initiative to build a thriving, healthy community around the Muslim center of Detroit, and to organize Muslims throughout the metro area in the fight to achieve racial and economic justice in Detroit's neighborhoods. And our final guest is Hanan Adi Yahya, a first-generation Yemeni American raised in Detroit. With over 10 years of community advocacy and leadership experience, her work focuses on developing neighborhoods and cities with a focus on access, equity, and sustainability. She graduated from the University of Michigan in 2017, where she studied urban studies and entrepreneurship. And she is also the community and policy coordinator for Detroit City Council member Raquel Castaneda Lopez. Thank you all for taking the time to talk with us today. Just a few quick instructions before we begin our conversation. So thank you all for joining us. For those of you who are joining us live, either on Zoom or Facebook, please drop any questions you have into the Zoom Q&A box or through the Facebook comments section, and we will make sure we get to them during the talk. For those joining us on Zoom, I also want to bring your attention to the live transcript button on your Zoom screen for closed captioning for this talk. Finally, I would like to thank our sponsors, the Doris Duke Foundation, the Knight Foundation, the Community Foundation of Southeast Michigan, the Michigan Council for the Humanities, and the Center for Arab American Studies. So, Namira, Brother Mark, Hanan, I thought we could begin by having all of you better introduce yourselves. Perhaps you can go over what are the issues, concerns, and social problems you work on. How did you become involved in this type of work? And what inspired and keeps inspiring you, because we know how hard it is, to continue working for social change? Namira, do you want to go first, since you were?
Sounds good. We were all doing the chicken, like who's unmuting first. Assalamu alaikum to everyone who's joining us today. Thank you so much, Halal Metropolis, for hosting. I'm a huge fan of the work, and I've been talking about this work, especially before the pandemic hit. So I'm really excited to be here. In terms of my background, so I've been kind of wearing these two different hats of, an attorney and then also a graphic designer for over a decade now. And it's been something that I've really been weaving together these different pieces around like creativity and then community building and all of that work. So when I think to what kind of grounds me in the type of work I do, like, you mentioned in the introduction, my specialty area is human rights education and training. And so the concept around this, it's such a like subspecialty area of human rights law. And the idea is that human rights, it's not something that people just pick up through osmosis. It's not something that is just kind of obvious to everybody sometimes. It's an area that needs to be taught. And it's part of that understanding that history needs to be taught, and what history is currently being taught, and what values are we making sure to pass down to future generations. And so my particular area of work is really looking at this process. I mean, this issue of genocide has impacted every continent, every decade. We have seen communities subject to this kind of hate. And so for my aspect of the work that I do, it's really thinking about how do we interrupt that process? How do we disrupt what causes dehumanization of other people? And how do we teach that? So how do we approach this as something that if we are insisting that never again for some of these issues, how do we actually get there? And so for how I got into this work. I remember at one point I mentioned that I stumbled into Muslim Arc's work. But I was talking to a narrative coach, and she was like, "Nobody just stumbles into this work. Like, what actually like led you to this work?" And I found myself really reflecting. Certainly, my childhood. My parents are from Bangladesh, and I remember being a child, having my mom play the videotape of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman giving a speech, right before 1971's Liberation War. And that's been something that has been in the background, really thinking about generational threads of working for change. And especially locally, I was born in Detroit, raised in the Metro Detroit area, and recognizing how systemic racism impacts, education. When I was a freshman in college and tutoring after school in Detroit, that was something that really grounded me in space. And so for my areas of focus with Muslim Arc, as a co-founder there and a senior trainer, board member currently, I'm also on the design team at the Detroit Equity Action Lab, which is grounded very much and rooted in Detroit, housed at Wayne State Law School. And I'm somebody who is serving as a consultant for numerous different clients to think about holding space for these kind of conversations around human rights education and training.
Great, thank you. Mark, brother Mark, since you're next in line, we'll go with you.
Yeah, I should have gone first. I shouldn't have let Namira set the standard. Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and thank you to the team at Halal Metropolis for the program. Very, very excited to talk to you all tonight. So my background, as was mentioned in the bio, I'm actually, my day job, if you will, is as Chief of Member Experience at Move On. We're a national political action committee. I've spent the better part of a decade there now. Started there as a campaign director, working across a range of issues before creating our mobile team, and then ultimately creating what we call our member experience department. And so I have a background in sort of campaigning and technology, sort of integrated marketing. In a previous life, I actually did web development when I was younger, and also, began at a young age to get involved in very hyper local organizing. And by that, I mean my high school campus and then my college campus, and then a particular neighborhood in Chicago, and then similarly in Detroit once I moved back home. And so that work has began at a very early age for me, but it was a job right out of college, actually, at a place called the Inner City Muslim Action Network, where I really started to receive some formal training in community organizing. And alhamdulillah, I was blessed to do it in a way that was also combined with examples from the seerah of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, in a really deliberate way of bringing together, the prophetic tradition with sort of kind of grass tax, like Chicago style community organizing. And so, getting into the digital space, digital organizing, online mobilizing and campaigning brought together, an early love of technology with some of that early organizing experience. I was blessed to come home in 2013 and pretty quickly get involved with this organization that we call Dream of Detroit, where I'm now the sort of executive director. I'm hoping that Dream of Detroit in the near future will be my day job instead of just a labor of love. And so we're sort of working toward that on a number of fronts, and really starting to kind of institutionalize it after sort of 6 or 7 years as a community project. And a community project that a lot of people, alhamdulillah, have adopted and made their own and contributed to. We've mobilized over 500 volunteers over the last 6 or 7 years. We do work not just in the local Muslim community, well, particularly out of the Muslim Center, but then the sort of Metro Detroit Muslim community, but also in coalition with a lot of organizations doing justice work throughout Detroit's neighborhoods. And so our work tends to be in housing development, where we rehabbed about 14 homes, including really exciting special projects like the Indus Detroit home, where Halal Metropolis exhibit debuted year before last, like our project Homecoming Transitional House, which is getting off the ground right now, and then like a bunch of residences where families are moving in. We do that housing development also with economic development, looking to ultimately build a thriving stretch down Woodrow Wilson Street here in Detroit, maybe even one day renaming it, but we won't go there today. Then community organizing being that third leg, because we have to say, I'll kind of close with this, we started to move tens and ultimately hundreds of thousands of dollars into the neighborhood in terms of rehabbing home after home after home. And we had to say, is that really the best use of all of our resources when we're not also yet contributing to solving the systemic issues that have made our neighborhoods look like this? And this is when we sort of ramped up the organizing aspect of our work and started to get a lot more intentional with our residents. Joined a group called the Coalition for Property Tax Justice, which is working for compensation for overtaxed Detroiters. News came out last year that Detroiters were overtaxed to the tune of $600 million over the last decade. Just really just theft, robbery. And so those are some of the issues that we work on.
I'm so inspired by my brother and sister on the call. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Good evening. I'm Hanan Yahya. I currently work for Detroit City Council member Raquel Castaneda Lopez. So a lot of my current work is centered in District 6 in the city of Detroit. But I also like to identify myself as an urban strategist in the making, also a social entrepreneur. My work has primarily been focused in Detroit, having grown up here, and I can tell a little bit more about that story. But my work also encompasses sort of political organizing for Yemen as well. And that has taken shape in different forms. I think most recently, one of my projects had been Stories Never Told. It was it's on pause right now, but it was a traveling exhibit featuring 24 Yemeni artists from around the world, telling the stories of Yemen's crises and also telling the stories of its artistic renaissance that was born out of the crises. And so that was my way of channeling my creativity and organizing experience to move people, to educate them on what's happening and the role of the US government in the war as well. And so those were my objectives. But going back to Detroit, I grew up in Southwest Detroit. My family moved from Yemen when I was 3, and I attended a charter school here in the neighborhood. I still live here. And growing up in Detroit teaches you a lot of things. It opens your eyes up to, what life is like as a poor immigrant kid in the city. Limited resources, limited opportunities, walking down the street and seeing a city that's abandoned, essentially. And so I was recruited when I was 14 to join a local organization, to just be their youth member. And since then, I had participated in plenty of youth committees, and that really sparked my interest in urban development, in community development. I had always been very passionate about transforming my community here in Southwest. And obviously that translated into my current role right now for the city council person for this district. And what I do essentially is, so my role is community and policy coordinator, but I like to just say that I'm an organizer. I work one-on-one with residents and community groups to build their capacity. We're very different than other public elected officials' offices in that, we have a team designated primarily on neighborhood building and coalition building, so that we're not just responding to cases, they're not just our constituents. We're really trying to mobilize people and provide them with the skill sets that they need and give them access to the city and all the resources they need to thrive and empower their own neighborhoods. So for example, I actually just got off a meeting a few minutes ago with a group in one of the most blighted neighborhoods in the city, which is located in District 6. It's called Midwest. That's the city adopted name, but it's also known to some people as Old West Side. And it's actually just 5 minutes up from a 5-minute drive from my neighborhood, just right here. And so this meeting was focused on rezoning parcels of land located in the community next to residential homes. They are currently zoned industrial, and so there's a heavy concentration, over 80 just in the small, square mile of a neighborhood, 80 auto-related businesses in just one neighborhood that is zoned industrial. And so we are trying to downzone all of these parcels back to residential or neighborhood commercial, so we can bring more commercial activity that really meets the needs of the community. And so that is like one example of the projects that we do alongside community leaders and groups. I run a leadership series program through our office where we recruit 30 emerging leaders from the district, and we teach them all the skills that they need or that they desire, how to advocate for themselves, how to use social media, how to tell their own story, etc. I also lead environmental justice legislative projects on the team. So if you are all familiar about a year and a half ago in 2019, the Revere dock collapsed into the river, and there was potential for a lot of toxins to be in our drinking water. And so our office responded to that by working with coalitions that work in environmental justice to work on an ordinance that really holds these bad actors accountable for their actions, and to really provide more oversight for commercial properties that are along the river. So a lot of our upcoming legislative ordinances will be focused on protecting air quality and land and our water as well. So that's another piece of my work. Sorry, I'm going on and on now, but my job is really multifaceted. I do grassroots efforts, I do legislative work, and this is really, I'm going into my 4th year with the office and very excited about what's to come. But I like it because it's a nice balance of community engagement and community building, and really advocating for them on the city level, and making long-term sustainable solutions to those needs and those problems. And I think that's what's important. That's the really important piece of advocacy is that balance. So thank you.
So I'm going to follow up on that sort of grassroots versus policy change. But before that, I thought I'd want to ask sort of, all of you guys are involved within the Muslim community and outside, working with organizations in both. So I'm really curious about how you kind of lens yourself as a Muslim activist. Like, what does that mean to you? How does it influence your actions or activity, or does it not? Is it just the fact that you're working and in the community? Also, how does your work really impact the visibility of the Muslim community, both inside some of the work that you're doing within the community and with outside organizations?
I'm going to give Mark the chance to go first this time, if he wants to.
I set myself up for that one. Yeah, so this question, I don't, I've never really lensed myself as a Muslim activist per se. Now, that said, Dream is certainly tied to the Muslim Center over here in this West Side neighborhood of Detroit. And we say we're combining organizing and development to revitalize this neighborhood, but certainly we're in this neighborhood because of the presence of this masjid and community center, which was here for, nearly 30 years before Dream was even started. And so that's certainly a reality. And I think, the idea that in a city, that has such a rich history of Muslim presence, and particularly Black Muslim presence, that an intentional effort for us to sort of have a bigger footprint and physical presence and neighborhood visibility, is warranted. 100 years after 100 years later. So that is, certainly at the core of what we're doing here, and I'm very grateful for the families that have moved into the neighborhood over the last few years, because of a very sort of intentional community building, and wanting to be a part of that in particular. I also think that it's important for Muslims to be involved in the broader conversation about justice for Detroit's neighborhoods, because truly what happened in Detroit over the last certainly 15 years is just an absolute travesty with, you know, the county foreclosures that I mentioned a little bit earlier, the property tax foreclosures, you know, that foreclosed on 1 in 3 homes in the city of Detroit. You know, a rate not seen since the Great Depression. Um, and really to what end? To balance the books of the county so that it wouldn't go into state receivership. I mean, really, like really twisted ends. We destroyed the city. We hollowed it out through terrible political judgment, criminal political judgment. Um, and so, you know, I think that, you know, Muslims, you know, we're a very charitable community. And I think, you know, the evolution of that charity has to be, you know, systemic change and accountability. Um, you know, and so particularly, you know, when we talk about housing work and you know, as it is, certainly we know the centrality of community in our tradition and the numerous sort of admonitions from the Prophet to stay in community and to not veer from it. But also, you know, the Prophet Muhammad names housing as one of sort of 3 human rights that he enumerates for the son of Adam when he says, you know, clothing, housing, and food and water, essentially. And so, or shelter, and say housing with shelter, but you know, housing. And so, when we, you know, to us, this would seem to be a non-controversial issue in the context of our tradition, and something that folks from, you know, across the spectrum of Muslim political practice could hopefully, you know, embrace for its value. Um, so that's, you know, dreams work. So certainly, yeah, heavily rooted in the Muslim community, heavily inspired by our values. Um, Personally, you know, I've been doing this work since well before I took Shahada. In a sense, you know, I was inspired toward, you know, community building, you know, and particularly racial justice work at an early age. And you know, I studied, you know, political science and Black studies at college, and I used to say, you know, Black people in politics are my two passions. And then in my senior year of college, I was introduced to this thing called Islam, right? And that changed my life and you know, added a whole nother lifetime of learning to do. And so, you know, certainly that has guided me over the last decade or more. Um, but but no, to be short, no, I've never, I don't term myself typically a Muslim activist. And when I think of that term, typically I think of people, you know, doing, you know, much more, you know, like overtly spiritual work and you know, imams and preachers and
Mhm.
those types of activists.
I would have to echo those sentiments, especially that last couple of lines that my brother Mark mentioned. I don't categorize myself as a Muslim advocate. Ever since a young age, I think, I mean, as a Yemeni, you know, the Yemeni community is very conservative in that right. And it's a beautiful thing that we grew up with close ties to our deen and our faith tradition. And I think I always held that close to me, and that was always that intrinsic compass that I could maybe, you know, never, um, I never felt comfortable publicly, you know, sharing that, because that was always something that I felt was like a test between me and my creator, and was something that just guided my work. Um, but I think part of it is, you know, you also, I think I'm in a place where I'm still figuring out, you know, what that looks like at the same time. I think this work is naturally very beautiful in that you're giving back to the community and you're doing what's right. I think part of my challenge doing this work as well is working in a city like Detroit, where you know, sometimes the challenge to solve Detroit's problems means going up against your own community, right? The very you know, racist, anti-black sentiments that I heard growing up in the Arab community, and especially for a city like Detroit, that really never had an opportunity to to have its own voice, or, you know, for its people, primarily, you know, a majority Black city, to speak on its own. I think growing up, I was always belittled for living in Detroit, for surrounding myself with folks who live in Detroit, and that's the reality. Um, And I would never shy away from that. And I think that's part of the struggle, right? It's like, I'm Muslim, my faith tells me to do X, Y, and Z to give back to the community. And that means challenging my Muslim brothers and sisters in this line of work, you know, and that means members of my own community. And I think that's, you know, one of the projects that was born out of this for me this last summer after the protests began, the Detroit Will Breathe movement, and after the murder of George Floyd, I worked with friends to start a group called Tairamana, which is a collective that addresses anti-Blackness in the Yemeni community. And so, you know, that was one thing that I thought was necessary and long overdue because we have a lot of business owners that are, you know, Arab or identify as Muslim in the city of Detroit. And we see this across the US as well in major cities, right? As well. So it's not just Detroit, but I feel that in my line of work, especially. And so in that sense, I use my faith. I do say I am Muslim, and I hold others accountable who identify as Muslim as well, right? But I don't, you know, enter spaces with my head up high like that. I think it's just, again, it's an intrinsic compass for me, and that's just between me and my creator.
Yeah, that resonates a lot, both of what Mark and Hanan said. Yeah, because I don't think I've ever said the words that I'm a Muslim activist. Now that I think about it, where I'm like, you know what? Actually, I usually talk about kind of my occupations, right? Like around like lawyer and graphic designer, and then my ethnicity. It absolutely grounds everything I do. I mean, that's kind of the interesting dynamic of this. I mean, for myself, like I didn't start wearing hijab until I was 19 years old. And so for the longest time, there was this tension around even how I was appearing in certain spaces. I had a roommate in college, I remember, whose friends would consistently joke like, oh yeah, so-and-so's Hindu roommate. And there's this tension around just Bengali identity, right? And so I encountered that a lot during growing up in kind of a masjid in Southeast Michigan, as well as at MSA spaces as well, where there's this tension around, you know, especially looking at the subcontinent, the history of Bangladesh, like Bengali is being seen as less Muslim and, you know, further away from the faith than other people in the subcontinent, namely Pakistanis, right? And so that tension has always influenced how close I feel to kind of the standard American Muslim identity. I think I'm grateful for it, but also it's led to feeling a sense of like, yeah, I'm at the edges of the community, right? Which may or not might not be true, but it's something that has resonated a lot like over the years in terms of whether I really talk for American Muslims or can represent American Muslims. And I think especially in the last few years and with Muslim Arc's work, it's been something very intentional that I've pushed to say, like, do not ask one Muslim, especially in the United States, to speak for all Muslims. That's something that I really resent. And that's something for myself when I walk into a space. And yes, I'm coming in with this very, you know, faith-based analysis, faith-based motivation as to why I'm there and why I'm doing the work I'm doing. But at the same time, like I speak for myself and for my own story and my own backstory. And that's hopefully encouraging other people to provide that space for the diversity of American Muslim stories. And I think especially for the work at Muslim Arc, being a faith-based organization, that's been a huge part of why we do the work the way we do around amplifying the diversity of American Muslims and recognizing how many different stories, how many different generations, how many different movements are represented by American Muslims. So especially domestically from abroad, right? And all of these different stories. I would say so much of what I do is inspired by faith and this conversation around being Muslim. There's certain hadith that I especially talk about a lot, and in workshops with other, you know, non-Black Muslims of color, to discuss like why is it that we should be invested in racial justice? Like what does our faith call for? How can we reground ourselves in principles that should be dictating our work, that should be ensuring that we are standing firm for justice, right, across all different lenses? And a couple of things that I often mention is, you know, one, the mantra to, you know, tie your camel and trust in Allah. Like, what are we doing to do that, right, when it comes to working in our communities? And then the other one that especially lately I've been talking about quite a bit has been this idea that, the Prophet ﷺ mentioned that, if the day of judgment was tomorrow and that you had a sapling in your hand, to plant the sapling, right? And this concept unpacks so much of how we do the work and why we do the work, because especially Muslim work was founded during the Obama administration, right? So we started in 2014, and then we saw how things shifted with the Trump administration, and then now with the Biden administration, how like the political winds changing influences what people see as trendy. And so for this work, it's this reminder around, we're doing the work for the action itself, we're doing the work for the sake of Allah, and that we will inshallah be rewarded for the work regardless of what the outcome is. And that's really important because it regrounds us in the principle of why are we doing this work. It's not because it's trendy, it's not for social media clout, it's not because it's some kind of, we're not even expecting a certain action. Even if a campaign fails, it's still worth it in the sense that we will be rewarded for it. And so in that lens, yes, like, as a Muslim in this space, this is completely influencing me. But I often find myself resisting being like that token face of the one Muslim in the space, or, a Muslim woman, especially the narratives around Muslim women breaking barriers, right? Or some of the stereotypical things where it's like, nope, like I don't want that. So I would say it grounds me, and it's completely why I show up and how I try to show up in spaces, but I do resist the lensing of that.
Great, thank you. I think you've all alluded to kind of grassroots efforts versus kind of bigger policy or kind of political change. We all know, our institutions need to be changed, but I guess I'm curious on how does actually grassroots efforts, sort of your activism, advocacy, actually affect policy? Now I'm thinking about also the rise of the Muslim voice in politics. Does that affect things, or has that affected? Will it affect? Does it change how you guys think about advocacy and activism? Is it all the same? The struggle is always the same. Always, keep eye on power. So yeah, how is all that? How are you guys thinking about that? But also, how does it work? I think a lot of us don't actually quite understand how you make things happen.
My analysis of it, I mean, for myself, especially as a lawyer, I think there is an understanding that different people have different roles to play, and especially thinking about things. And it's not nearly as neat as an outside inside strategy, but I do think there's some wisdom to it. For myself, it's like lawyers are in a position to both uphold certain systems that exist. We're kind of the cogs in the machine for keeping things going. But we're also the people who are challenging things and filing lawsuits and pushing, and especially people who would consider themselves movement lawyers, to consistently push, right, and to file and kind of file these lawsuits that are challenging the way things are being done. And they're looking for a better application of the law in a fair kind of lens. At the same time, there's so much to be said around just the structures that currently exist. I mean, there's no way around the fact that this country is founded on twin evils of indigenous genocide and of anti-Black racism. And so given that, that's how the laws are structured, that's how so many of our institutions are structured. And over the centuries, there's been so much resistance and fighting, both thinking about people who are elected into positions of power, but also people who are very much outside the system agitating. And that has led to change, but that's also led to the systems morphing over time as well, which means that we need all of it, and that things are consistently kind of trying to reground itself in this very white supremacist framework. And so how do we push that? And I think for many people, they make the mistake of assuming that there's only like a couple of ways to be involved in a movement. There's a resource by Deepa Iyer that's called the Social Change Ecosystem, and it talks about different roles that different people should be playing in a movement. A healthy movement does not have every single person being the agitator or the disruptor. We need people like that, but we also need storytellers, and we need healers, and we need people in different roles to accomplish this kind of change. So for myself, thinking about social change, and then especially grassroots communities, I feel like a healthy model is to have representation from grassroots that's very much grounded in the grassroots in these positions of power. I also think that given how power operates, which power can corrupt, and power can also create these constraints and restrictions on people, that if they decide to try to disrupt certain systems, that they can be not reelected, right? Or they can just be boxed into a certain space to say like, oh yeah, you know, we're not paying attention to you anymore. So I feel like an analysis of power is recognizing that the stronger our grassroots communities are, that's where the reliable, longstanding strength is going to be coming from. And I often would mention this in the lens of like elections, right? Because there's a lot of rhetoric around elections where it's like, this is the way we accomplish change as we get more elected representatives. But I often say, you know, true power would be a community that regardless of who's in office, the community has so much power that the elected official has to listen to them. And that they have to respond regardless of who is in that role. And it's not as simple as that, but I do think that a different understanding of grassroots. It's like with Malcolm X and Dr. King, right? Like Malcolm would talk about how because of how he was presenting, people then saw Dr. King as being more reasonable, where, you know, so many people thought Dr. King was like completely, you know, leftist and being completely radical in how he was approaching things. So I think there's that relationship is really important around recognizing where grassroots communities are coming from and that true power is within the grassroots, and that's where it should be.
Yeah, I can hop in on that. I mean, you know, I just echo and agree with so much of what Namir already shared. So I'll try not to be repetitive. I think, you know, when we talk about, you know, the grassroots, you know, even to just put it in simpler terms, we're talking about regular everyday people whose lives are impacted by these very policies that we're talking about trying to impact, right? That's who this boils down to. And so um, you know, again, not to try not to be too repetitive, but when we look at like our work in the neighborhood, um, um, you know, a healthy sort of civic ecosystem has, you know, empowered residents who are in conversation with, you know, you know, electeds and, you know, other decision makers in sort of city government, and, you know, going on up the levels. And you know that for those residents to be empowered, you know, typically they have to be organized. It has to happen through some deliberate effort. And you know, Dreams work has been a combination. You know, we sort of organize a base that's at the intersection of our local Muslim community and the folks who are living in our neighborhood and have been for, you know, in some cases 40, 50, 60 years. And so we started, you know, the neighborhood block club in this area, which sort of maps onto our impact turf with our organizing team. And you know, we registered it with the city, and it's in conversation with the district office and all of that. But really, we started it to make sure that the longtime residents in the neighborhood were directly plugged into our work, felt that like they had a stake in our work, didn't feel, you know, alienated by the fact that, like, you know, our acronym has the word Muslim in it, and didn't feel, so we try to both celebrate our identity while not letting it, you know, separate us from the folks that we're in community with around here. And so, you know, but the point just being that, like, having built that base, having made that club active, you know, we can get, you know, how vacant housing issues taken care of when we need to, or we can have, you know, sort of presence at different places when it's requested. You know, a better example of sort of organized residents from across the city, you know, exerting a bit of political power with our Coalition for Property Tax Justice. We've been asking for the city council and the mayor's administration to acknowledge the scope of the program with property tax foreclosures in the city of Detroit over the last decade. And about a month ago, the mayor introduced an ordinance that would have acknowledged a very select period of the problem that predated him coming into office, and would have sort of codified that as like the extent of the problem. And this is something that, you know, he had the votes for going into the session of city council where they were debating this. And folks from the coalition and folks who've been impacted by property tax foreclosure and others showed up in large numbers to speak against this, and ultimately were able to flip two of the city council members to stop this ordinance from going through. And so hopefully we'll have an opportunity in the future to pass an ordinance that really acknowledges the full scope of the program, so that everyone in that range of impact, you know, that period can find some sort of recompense.
I appreciate the ideas and the thoughts that were presented so far, and I agree 100%. I'll just share an example of a project that our team had worked on since the summer, and this is something that is publicly known as the Detroiters Bill of Rights, and this was a perfect project that embodies co-governance between an elected body and the residents that it serves, and so this Bill of Rights identifies 8 policy recommendations, such as the right to water, the right to recreation, the right to environmental health, the right to mobility, etc. And each of these rights has detailed policy recommendations that we wanted to amend in the city charter. And so this hasn't really been done before in any city. And we've actually been successful at passing them thus far. Within the charter commissions, the city charter commission. But essentially doing this means that, you're embedding these basic human rights essentially into the city's constitution. It's harder to, remove or amend in the future. And the city is responsible for enforcing these provisions. So say, for example, the right to recreation, one of the policy provisions was to establish a minimum urban green space requirement, that adopts the World Health Organization standard, so that every Detroiter has 10-minute walking access to a recreational space, be it a trail or a park or a garden, etc. And so, and another one is to establish an environmental commission, made up of environmentalists and organizers and everyday Detroiters impacted by the environmental issues that exist in the city. They would sit on this commission and review projects, development projects, and other huge happenings in Detroit to make sure that that the environmental protections are in place. And so that's just a couple of examples of this particular right, but essentially from the beginning, this entire project was born out of grassroots organizing, and meaning community engagement, and I think community engagement, people have different terminology or different understandings of it. And when people say outreach, community outreach, and I think community engagement, I've come to understand, my personal analysis of it, is really the most important and key piece of doing public service work, period. And people assume putting a flyer online or, going on Instagram Live, for example, which is, not a bad thing, right? But essentially, community engagement is a holistic approach to engaging every person that lives within the area that you're working on, that you're servicing. And so that for me, it gets down to, going door to door to folks, and talking to them and engaging them. And in a city like Detroit, people have so much distrust in the government and in different groups and leaders because they've been let down so many times. And now, it's up to grassroots organizers and this approach to build that connection again, and to empower them once again to be members of these groups, and to stay engaged and stay connected. That's part of the challenge, but essentially it is going door to door, it is calling people, it is building those individual relationships. That's what grassroots for me and in this work means. And the work is 10 times more successful when you do that, whether you fail or not. The real success is really building those relationships, is empowering. And I know empowerment and power is a buzzword nowadays, but really, giving folks whatever they need to thrive in their communities and become active members, and keeping them engaged in every step of the process. That's what, for me, grassroots organizing is. It's not just putting a flyer up and expecting people to show up and then making the decision anyway. It's co-governance at every stage in the process of whatever you're doing, be it a project or a policy or a, an event or anything of that nature. So that's my understanding.
Well, thank you. I'm going to ask one more question before we then move on to the audience. So, the last year and actually the past 4 years, but have been especially hostile to the Muslim community with the Muslim ban, with the rise of Islamophobia, but also how COVID has affected our communities. But as we now start thinking about the future, what do you guys see as the most significant or particular concerns for the Muslim community? And actually, I should say Muslim communities, as they're actually quite different, perhaps, both externally and internally. And then what are some of the issues that we are not seeing and we should? And then last, what more can our communities do to support efforts for social justice?
Can I jump in here and sort of not answer the question entirely?
Totally great.
I want to be the guy who goes back to like a previous question first. I want to, you mentioned like sort of ascendant, Muslims sort of ascendant in political arena and other institutions. And I just want to say to that point, obviously, Muslims in office and so forth, and whatever sort of roles we're in are multidimensional and complex individuals. I do think that we should lean into some particular policies that that our faith speaks particularly strongly to. And so, for instance, when you talk about the ban on usury, there's a bill going through the state house right now, to permit payday loans, to have up to like I think 132% interest per year. Right. These are the sorts of things that Muslims again can be united in speaking against, and the sorts of things that like are designed specifically to target and oppress poor people, and a place where we could intervene and help make a difference. And then when we talk about institutions, a friend and a supporter of Dream, a brother named Kai Safety, had a good piece I thought that ran in Cranes Detroit a couple of months ago, that was about corporations, being more transparent in their their demographic reporting around not just hiring, but procurement and outsourcing and so forth. The point that he was making was that immigrant entrepreneurs like himself have benefited greatly from minority contracting in ways that Black folks frankly have not in particular. And so, his call was to folks in the business community to take a first step of being more transparent in these hiring and procurement practices and contracting practices, as a first step down the road to being more equitable in those practices. So just to that point that Namira made about folks, not everyone having to play the same role and people sort of exercising influence in their, within that sphere that they have influence in. I don't have a bunch to say about the last 4 years. I remember going into the Trump administration, speaking with a reporter who asked, like, how was Dream's work going to change? And my basic response was like, we still got houses to rehab. Like, we still got super hyper local problems to deal with, that ultimately, like, the loud guy on Twitter isn't gonna, sort of directly impact us on a day-to-day basis. Obviously, there are very, direct and nuanced ways in which he does. But, the point just being that, like, there's work for us to do as Muslim communities, and particularly focused in urban areas that isn't tied to the sort of typical things that are seen as part of the Muslim agenda. And I think that there's space for it. It's a selfless space for us to lean into. It's a self-interested space in some real ways too, but it's a place for us to maximize like our contribution to to this country.
So I think what I can, yeah. all that Mark just said, I really, especially around like the Muslim agenda, like one of my pet peeves is the term Muslim issues. Like it just drives me up a wall because the idea that there are Muslim issues, what that usually leads to is people talking about foreign policy, talking about immigration, and talking about like the religious buildings, right? Around like mosque bans or like zoning issues around mosques and all of that. But yes, these are certainly Muslim issues, but the reality is like all of these issues that are affecting people in the United States should be Muslim issues. The environment and our ecosystem is a Muslim issue. For a faith that needs to make ablution, make wudu 5 times a day to pray, like we should be concerned about water and water shutoffs in Detroit and poisoned water in Flint, right? For transportation and for housing, all of these things are Muslim issues. For healthcare and having healthcare for all people to be able to take care of their bodies, you know, the body, we have a right. Our bodies have a right over us as Muslims. And so thinking about healthcare as a Muslim issue, right? Like, and especially thinking about poverty, I often talk about the reality, and for myself, like being a legal services attorney for a couple of years, like, you know, I was one of the intake attorneys that would be the person when somebody walked off the street and they would talk about needing legal services and they are falling within the poverty line, right? These are Muslim issues, that there are poor people in our neighborhoods and in our cities, and that this is not seen as a Muslim issue. Like that to me just always blows my mind. And so for us looking forward, one of the things and one of the reasons that I mentioned the fact that we need to be doing things based on principles and not on trendiness is because of that political wind aspect, right? So who is in office and what are their areas of focus? Regardless of who is in office, certain things need to be our priority. Regardless of whether it is trendy to talk about poverty in the United States, it needs to be our issue. And I feel like, especially as Muslims in this space, it's like, if we're looking back to prophetic behavior, what is the prophetic model for our neighborhoods? That is what Muslim issues should be looking like. And so really addressing poverty, addressing systems of oppression around enslavement and around discrimination and tribalism and the ways these things are playing out in communities, these are our issues. And so looking forward to the next 4 years and, you know, in the future too, uh, we need to be standing firm in that, you know, to say that this is an issue that we should be addressing. You know, as Muslims, we are looking at clean water, we're looking at the environment, we're looking at education, and we're looking at inequities at all levels, but especially local levels. I remember I was listening to a talk by a sheikh based out in, I believe in California, and he kind of gave us this question to think about. He's like, okay, imagine that a companion of the Prophet, peace be upon him, was in your neighborhood. What would that neighborhood look like after 2 years? And so the ways that sometimes we show up in spaces, and especially what gets media coverage nowadays, is not tied to that level of change within a space. And so that question often grounds me in thinking about, okay, what kind of change do I want to see? What kind of change am I supporting? And who else am I partnering with to bring about these very fundamental changes around poverty and wealth, around the environment, and around community building, and the health and well-being of so many different people in our neighborhoods.
I 100% agree with all of that. Thank you so much for sharing, Namira. I would only like to add that, you know, growing up in a city like Detroit, and I've already talked about this just a little bit, being a Yemeni, and just seeing the huge differences between living in an urban environment like this, and, you know, driving 5 minutes east into Dearborn and experiencing the different treatment there from fellow Arab Americans and fellow Muslim Americans is terrible. And on a larger scale, I think, you know, I agree with that note that Namira made about trendiness. I don't like to attach myself to any of those agendas. I think I have been very particular about the work that I want to do. You know, that hasn't been a motive or inspiration. I think it's great that Muslim Americans are running for office and representing their communities. And I think they're doing that in a wonderful way, because you know, a good friend of mine, Ibrahim Ayash, you know, first Yemeni American in Lansing and the capital, and that's wonderful. And he represents one of the most diverse districts in the state. And I think what makes him, a better, I guess, publicly Muslim, identified Muslim man is that he meets all of those needs and he represents those interests of such a diverse community, not because, because of that title, because of that identity. It's his work that reflects him. And so I want to see more of that. And I'll support that. And if that's the Muslim agenda, then I'm on board with that. Everything else, to be honest, I disregard, because there's too many fires to put out to jump on the bandwagon for any, temporary, there are important issues for sure. Certainly Muslim ban is a one, is a real issue, but we need to understand that these, oppressive tactics are shared amongst communities, and we need to, build coalitions and heal. And I wanted to bring that up earlier. I think there's a divide that, between Detroit and the suburbs, and Detroit hasn't healed from its the racial oppression that exists, and it's still, if anything, there's more tyranny and there's more trauma. I think I heard on a podcast that people are healing from the trauma from the last few decades that happened in Detroit, but they're also trying to, they're being also actively traumatized in today's conditions in a city like Detroit. And the reason why we bring Detroit up, and I think it's such a huge reflection of what's happening on a larger scale in our communities, right? And so if we could do things more grassroots, more with better intentions in a city like Detroit, and if we heal that divide, I think there's more opportunity for long-term, healing and growth. But until then, until we address these basic issues in our Muslim community, the things that we hate to recognize, we refuse, I think the problems will continue. But, that's just the reality we live in.
Can I echo that last point about Detroit? And the fact that the sister said, like, the trauma is ongoing when it comes to the city of Detroit. And for folks who like Detroit, like sort of cultivates an underdog type of spirit because we've been beat up on so long. And if you're the type who likes the underdogs, Detroit's the type of city you root for. But it's because, like, they just keep on pummeling us, and I mean, like, a range of institutions and systems. And so you talk about, like, Detroit being the sort of canary in the coal mine for, well, just the example on the books for deindustrialization, but the canary in the coal mine for privatization of city services, for the charter school movement, for state takeovers of municipalities, an example of the state saddling the city with debt. An example of, from the earliest moments of real strong Black political power in the city, various institutions, striking back. You look at Judge Fiken, saying that no one person should have such control over the water department, once Coleman Young became mayor of the city, when it was totally okay for one person prior to Detroit's first Black mayor. You look at again, the bankruptcy in the emergency management situation. So, Detroit, just like she said, we just continue to be sort of traumatized, and it's it sort of inculcates this kind of fighting spirit in you.
And I wanted to add something too. I feel like we're all just adding things now, but I really feel like another kind of important challenge thinking forward is this assumption, because for myself, like my parents, we started out in Detroit. My dad came to Detroit to study at Wayne State University, and like we followed the patterns of white flight out into the suburbs. And so I've gotten that question before too, around, especially with some ARC's work, like, how does a girl from the suburbs end up in this kind of racial justice work? And that's real, and that's part of this conversation, because if I'm here in the space, that's part of the point, is how are we getting more people into the space and recognizing this as a specific challenge, especially for within the American Muslim kind of different communities. So this mentality that being in the suburbs is the marker of success and making it in the United States, even just that fundamental concept influences so much of American Muslim kind of work that I've seen. And some of the work that seems to be the most, I guess not popular necessarily, but the most safe work is that this is what success looks like. And I feel like there's so much importance around interrogating that narrative of what does success look like in this country. And so recognizing the ways that people have adopted really a white supremacist understanding of what being successful and what having resources means in this country has been tied to capitalistic ideas of what wealth is, right? And adopting that uncritically, that this is the way to be an American has caused so much damage within, especially, you know, non-Black, people of color, Muslim spaces, because that understanding means that this assimilation narrative, that that's how we make it. And yet the breaks that have happened within communities because of that, the lack of recognition for wealth of family, wealth of knowledge, wealth of time, wealth of certain other aspects that are truly what matters, has completely influenced how people are going about, you know, assimilating and becoming American. And so that has really been a challenge, especially to get people to interrogate that understanding that this is what success looks like, this is what being an American looks like. I often give people that question around, like, why is it that being an American means that you're thinking of being a white American who lives in the suburbs with 2.5 children and a white picket fence, right? Like, why is that your notion of being American? And why are we accepting that uncritically as being the best way to be, you know, in this country? So I think a huge challenge is around the education piece, the political education that's needed, but also the unlearning and the relearning that's needed around, you know, the harms that the system causes, especially tied to narratives and to these understandings of what matters.
Great, thank you. So Brianna D. Kingsley asks, how do you maintain hope in the face of harsh realities?
Well, I mean, I just say, I think, you know, Namira talked a lot to that in one of her answers when you just talk about our general disposition to continue this work until it's not available for us to do anymore, until we're not available to do it anymore. You know, and the hadith, the Prophet said something about, you know, planting that tree, even if you knew the day of judgment was tomorrow. One of my favorite events for Dream that we ever did was a day I joined with the Greening of Detroit to plant 114 trees throughout the neighborhood. It was really fun. I think we had about 300 people come out to help with that. You know, and it was, you know, symbolic in that sense that this was a neighborhood that that the city had given up on, that city planners had written off as they planned it for an ecological innovation zone. They said population attrition was too high, the area couldn't rebound. And yet we have families that have been over here for generations and lifetimes, and institutions that had put, you know, years of work and equity and millions of dollars into this very neighborhood that weren't walking away from it. So even when the things are sort of lined up against you, you know, your intentions are clear and you're sort of grounded in that intentionality. And trust me, it's hard for me not to focus on outcomes, but you know, we accept that ultimately we're not in control in that sense. Um, we do not accept that when it comes to holding government accountable. We focus on the outcomes. We hold them accountable to the outcomes. So that's part of our organizing work. But from a personal effort perspective, you know, we understand, you know, ultimately, you know, who and what is in control. So that, you know, is where you find kind of peace in the work.
I think naturally in this line of work, you're bound to face a lot of roadblocks and a lot of misfortune and just a lot of, yeah. I mean, the number of times I've walked away from meetings feeling like, wow, you know, we have a long way to go in the city of Detroit. We've got a lot of work to do. But to be honest with you, I think, you know, most of the time there's very little hope. I think I'm just, you know, I'm very passionate about the city, and I'm passionate about, you know, the future that it could, you know, the potential that it could hold. And I think I attach my hope to that. And then every day as I meet Detroiters, as I work with them one-on-one, and I hear their stories, and I listen to them and their wisdom, really, because they've been doing this work far longer than I have. most of them longer than I've been alive. So I think listening to them and hearing those stories, I have no choice but to have hope and you know, to go to work every day and do what I can. But that's just I'm not going to beat around the bush. It's, I think most of the time it's a very hopeless situation, but that's also part of the fight is trying to find those little bits and pieces of energy to push forward.
I don't know if it's Miriam Kaba who generated this saying, but she's somebody who I hear repeated a lot, which is that hope is a practice. And so this idea that looking at what's happening in the world, there's a lot of reasons to lose hope, right? There's so many things that are happening. I mean, right now with everything happening in Texas, with COVID, there's just so many places to feel like this is overwhelming and it's too much. And, you know, what chance do we really have to make a difference? But the reality is, as you are grounded in work, and I think that's a really important part of that community grassroots piece of things, is that you are grounded in community with other people. How can you not have hope, right? Looking at people in your community, at the things that people have faced and the things, I mean, there's stories that I've heard where I just look at the person, I'm like, how are they laughing at anything right now? Like, given that this traumatic situation happened. And then I look at like my own life, right? And certain losses that I've faced and the fact that I can still laugh, right? And I can still find joy in my everyday kind of existence. And the reality is like people are so resilient and we're here because people had hope. One of my favorite things about, you know, thinking about American Muslims and at Muslim Arc, like we were able to bring together, you know, truly representative spaces sometimes of American Muslims. And it's like, if I think about a room that really has American Muslims representative in that space across class and across race and ethnicity and age, I just recognize how many stories of resilience are in that space because people have witnessed and lived through and supported revolutions in the United States and everywhere else in the world. And they're here, you know, and you're hearing these stories about how people did that and the fact that they committed to something and that they aligned with something and that there were outcomes. And you see kind of a different picture around revolution when you think about that. You know, what is the fallout when a country does reach independence, right? For myself, that's been such an important learning around 1971 and the Liberation War in Bangladesh and what happened afterward, right? But then I see that, like, how there's hope, right? People are resilient and not everybody makes it. But the fact is that we're all here because somebody chose hope and chose to have joy and to practice that in their own spaces. So seeing people and seeing the relationships and seeing changes in people, especially over years, I think that always gives me hope. There's plenty to be hopeful about because we believe in people being able to sustain and to grow and to have each other with us, right? And to be able to choose that joy together is always giving me hope.
So our next question is, why is it important to rename streets that were named after racist leaders like Hubbard and Dearborn? And I'll tack on to that another question. What does the human rights future look like for Detroit? Those are kind of related, probably.
That second one, geez, I'll let somebody else handle that one. But I'll say on the symbol, you know, um, it, when I was in high school, we had this statue. I'm trying not to tell this story too long, but we had this statue. I went to high school in the suburbs at Cranbrook and Bloomfield Hills, and there was a science building. And in this building, there was this statue, this bronze sculpture of this man walking with two young folks on either side, one on either side of him. And the plaque for the sculpture said, Robert E. Lee, teacher of youth, right? Like Confederate General Robert E. Lee. And like every student has to walk past this statue every single day. You cannot avoid it for generations of students. And I'm thinking and worried particularly about the Black students. And so, you know, ultimately, you know, with a little like targeted pressure and some well-timed op-eds in the student paper and so forth, we were able to pressure the administration to remove that particular statue. And it's really funny because I had some classmates reach out in the wake of George Floyd protests when a lot of, you know, particularly, yeah, this past summer when some of the statues, for instance, there was like a statue pulled into a river in the UK, and when some of the statues were being taken down again, they reached out to apologize for not understanding the significance of what we were doing back then. And I raised those points just to say that these symbols contribute to a type of psychic violence that we can't ignore. And when you think particularly about young people having to walk past a statue of the man who defended the enslavement of our ancestors, and not only to have to see his likeness there, but to read something honoring him as a teacher of youth, in the early 2000s. Like, what is this? So, similarly, when we think about, the naming of some of these street signs and so forth, the reality is that, a lot of them, and certainly not all, and I'm not sitting here with an exhaustive inventory, but we're talking about, the honoring of a lot of unscrupulous folks. In particular, we're talking about, just by the very nature of our country, the honoring of a lot of outright racists, a lot of really hateful people, and particularly in a city like Detroit that today is 85% Black. A lot of people who don't represent, didn't love, didn't care for, didn't work for the people that hold down this city today. And so we deserve to see street signs that are named after the people whose legacies we honor. We deserve to see libraries named after our ancestors. We deserve to see public schools named after, pioneers in our community, and folks who have passed, and folks who are living legends, who should be honored. And so, this is one of the things that states, racist, state legislatures go out of their way to preclude municipalities from changing things like this. So in a city like Detroit, we might be hamstrung, for instance, by state legislation that would stop us from renaming some of these institutions. And we just have to be creative in our ways around it.
Yeah, all of that. And I'll just add that it's like, sometimes the narrative is that racism was a long time ago. It's in the past. Why are we still worried about it? It's like our freaking street names are still named after these people, right? So every single day there is this narrative that is set around who and what is important, and who are these figures that are important to continue seeing their names and learning their stories, right? As to what is the public narrative around who founded this country and why. And so especially when it comes to statues, these are symbols, and symbols uphold, they're kind of these foundations for narratives. And what narrative are we telling? That commonly stated phrase around history is written by the winners. That's part of the street signs, and that's part of the monuments that are still here. So if we are talking about really looking up to heroes, like I mentioned, there's always been people resisting. So why are we not seeing street names, for activists and figures? It's not just like the most popular and the most famous figures, but especially thinking about the fact that every single movement was so many different people. And especially if we need to think about white men and women to uphold and to have street names, there's a reason why it's not, white allies during the civil rights movement, that their names are not known, right? And their names are not the ones on those street signs. So what are we saying around who should we look up to? Who should we try to emulate? Who's important enough to really keep their name alive? That says a lot. And so, especially for that reason, I feel really strongly, some people think it doesn't matter, but I feel really, really strongly around that aspect of public narrative, and especially thinking about role models and whose names are we keeping alive.
I am not attempting to answer that second question. I'm just going to touch on one piece that is in terms of public narratives, as Namira was explaining. I think what's happening in the city right now is that the public narrative is very, very inaccurate about what's happening in the city in terms of the quote unquote comeback, right? Who's this comeback for? Where is this development happening? How are we able to, ensure human rights before all of that in that process? And I think that's not happening at all. And if someone points to the queue line on Woodward and says, "Oh, that's wonderful transit," then they have no understanding of what real access to transit and mobility looks like. When folks have to wait 45 minutes to get on a bus to get to where they need to go. I think folks in Detroit have been criminalized, have been dehumanized, have been the story has been so misconstrued for so long, and I think that's my fear with the city, is that if we continue on this path, then we're only repeating history, and people will continue to be marginalized, and you know, human rights and just basic quality of life is never going to be ensured. And so I think that's first and foremost in terms of a priority for you know, the future of Detroit, is controlling that narrative as much as possible, participating in it, correcting it, and you know, playing an active role in that process. And until we do that, I think the city is just going to be on this really, really terrible trajectory. You know, I know that there are good things happening in the city. We see that, but we need to be 1,000 times more intentional about the progress and the development, and we're not right now. A lot of it is very much a facade, a very pretty thing to look at, but it's not operational, it's not sustainable, it's not meeting anyone's needs. And that's my truth, and I think that's the truth that's happening in Detroit, and we need to shed light on that.
Yeah, and to that point, because when folks critique like our focus on symbols sometimes, and because there's in addition to street names that need changing, there's still statues of slaveholders downtown that need to be removed. But like, at least from my perspective, we're always talking about that and more, policy changes that have more material impacts for our communities and, have development implications and health outcomes and so forth. So, we're not just saying that like, oh, taking down these symbols is the most important thing or the only important thing, but it's certainly critical, and we can walk and chew gum at the same time in terms of managing these priorities.
Great.
And I wanted to uplift just something that Hanan had mentioned around the Detroiters Bill of Rights, because I think that question around like human rights future for Detroit, that Bill of Rights is such an important, there's been so much community engagement as to creating and developing that Bill of Rights. It's critical for thinking about where people want to see Detroit go and what we want to accomplish.
So the next two questions sort of are around mobilizing. So the first one is, maybe I'm gender stereotyping, but as a man who's often in human rights spaces, it's not common for me to see other brothers there. Women are taking the lead in doing the work, which is great. But how do we inspire our brothers to get involved? And sort of another kind of question again around mobilizing is, how do we get people to recognize and contribute, whether volunteering or monetarily, to the good work being done by already established organizations and communities instead of wanting to always create their own orgs or movements? And maybe the bigger question about mobilizing, especially within our communities.
So just before I forget for the third time, let me just answer that one question about support. People can definitely go to dreamofdetroit.org/donate to contribute to the work that we're doing in our neighborhood. We're also, I think we have a Launch Good campaign up right now. So if you went to launchgood.com/dreamofdetroit, you can see some of our work and some of the other stuff we've crowdfunded in the past. But yeah, dreamofdetroit.org and then /donate particularly. Number one, like a lot of, so part of it is like, folks checking their intentions. Why are you starting this new organization, right? Of course, like, so, there's that thing to sort of shake out. And then there's folks being intentional about like doing a proper sort of landscape analysis and understanding. And then there's like the slower, realer work of actually just like really gracefully entering community and learning from the people who are in the spaces already and taking lead from them and permission from them in some cases, et cetera. And so, but that requires a certain type of presence. And so, yeah, that's what I would offer to that particular question.
I'll add around support, and especially around like gender and some of these bigger questions. I think it goes to this larger point around what people think is the work. Because ultimately, if you think about there's certain like white supremacist cultural traits that show up in spaces, right? And a couple of the things that show up is like bigger is better or more is better. And that's always the goal. And at the end of the day, like recognizing and having humility around the fact that is a very cultural decision to say that that's what progress looks like, is progress is always more. and that we're focused on quantity instead of quality, right? Like these are traits that are ingrained and that sometimes they're seen as like a default, like, oh, of course, that's what progress looks like, right? That we just have more organizations and more of this and it's just bigger and better all the time. But the reality of this work is that it's how we're doing the work is the work, and the relationship building that's happening is the work. And it might not be as easy to put into some kind of report or to even put onto like a fundraising page, right? Because I know that some of the funding that goes into things, it's like they want to see that, right? Like progress is more, progress is bigger and better. Like, what have you done? Where is my money going? When the reality of the work is how we're doing the work. And I think that gets to that gender question too, because it's like if we're resetting some of these ways of engaging with one another, that means also recognizing the gender dynamics and what is seen as leadership in a space and who is seen as leaders in a space, and who is taken more seriously in the space, right? And so I think, and at Muslim Arc, like that was something that often came up around a lot of women in the space. And I'm like, yeah, but the men who are in the space, like they're very much in the space, right? And part of it is because of really recognizing that, you know, a way of being in a space where we're not prioritizing the one charismatic person at the head of the organization, where we're ensuring that everybody's pitching in, where we're multitasking and not leaving a certain task to somebody all the time, right? Like these defaults are being upended sometimes in spaces. So really being able to embrace that and lean into it and to work through discomfort is a lot of where the work needs to go. The discomfort that comes up is good. Like I ask people to embrace that discomfort. At Muslim Arc, we have trainings that are available. So I encourage people to check out like our monthly membership program, to book Muslim Arc for a training. But the reality is like the discomfort, please be curious about it. So for somebody who's looking to create a new organization, like that discomfort, lean into it. You know, be curious about, okay, are there other organizations doing this? Like, how can I get involved? How can I support? How can I really show up in a way that is not just recreating the wheel, or that is not recognizing contributions that other people have already been making? And where there are overlapping efforts, like how can we create a coalition, and recognizing that it's okay, right, to have coalitions with multiple people in it. So encouraging people to really embrace that these bonds and creating new spaces together that are healthy, that are thriving, that do not just replicate existing systems of oppression, like that is the work. And it's good to really support that and to fund it, to donate. And for people who maybe are kind of stuck with how do I get into the space or how do I do work, there's always something you can do in your space. If you have the money, donate. If you have the time, volunteer. If you have a specific space that you're in, racism is not exempt from any discipline or any field of study. So I often say to like people who are going to med school, right? There's racism in the medical space. There's racism in hospitals. There's racism in how healthcare is delivered. So take that on. You know, you're in that space, apply that racial justice, that anti-racism lens to whatever space that you are in.
100%. I agree. I also want to add in terms of the question about how to get brothers involved. As a Yemeni woman who grew up in a very tribal, conservative Yemeni community, the influence that mosques and religious institutions have on our community is strong, and it's powerful, and I think we can leverage that to influence youth, and to even our mothers and fathers and our uncles and aunts and everyone. Really, it's not just young folks. And I think that there's a lot of untapped energy there and potential. You go to the mosque and you hear the same lectures, right? You see, for me at least, the mosque I grew up going to, that reinforce the traditional roles of men and women, and that's why I think naturally, women gravitate towards these like public service careers, and they're told they should be nurses and not doctors. They're told to be social workers and not, anything else. And so I think there's a little bit of challenging that I like to do, which is why I call my work very grassroots. It's the mosque in this neighborhood, right? It's the folks who have the most influence on this block, etc. I don't really need to go far to make change. It's right here. I know where the challenges lie, and I think that leads to the other question, is that folks really want to sometimes get out and branch and go into other communities and feel like they're contributing there, and that's wonderful. I think that's needed, but I think where you're more needed is where you live, where you spend your time, where you recreate, where you eat, and so that's our communities. That's where we grow. So I think that's where our responsibility lies. And I've always known that ever since I was, when I got into this, right? Because I was pulled in as a young member in the community. And so I knew this was where I needed to be. And I was going to continue putting that effort there. And if there was opportunity for coalitions, I could do that and branch out. But essentially, I need to come back here and I need to do the work here before going anywhere else.
Great. So thank you. We're almost at time, but any last thoughts from our panelists, or also any announcements that you want to make? We'll do our best to also post certain websites, certain URLs for your organizations, but also articles on all the work you guys have been doing. But anything you guys want to say or tell us about that we should be aware of in the coming days, weeks, months?
I'll just start to end by saying thank you again to Halal Metropolis for organizing this and inviting us. It was a fun, kind of ranging conversation. I'm getting to the age where I talk too much and I want these things to go on for like 3 hours because they are so much fun to me. So I'm sorry it's ending already. I'll say, folks, please do visit us at dreamofdetroit.org. Please come see us in the summertime once we get back outside and things feel a little bit safer and more comfortable. We do several large service efforts throughout the year typically. But even beyond that, I would just ask for folks, prayers really. We've had, again, 14 home rehabs in this neighborhood. And even in the last year, while COVID sort of kept us quiet, we had 5 families move into the neighborhood, which was really exciting. We're about to launch a really large fund to do our next 15 properties, hopefully, inshallah, and then moving hopefully into new construction. To really lean into that idea that that every neighborhood in Detroit sort of does actually have a future, that's more than a slogan, and that particularly our community can really contribute to that. So again, dreamofdetroit.org and Dream of Detroit on all social media. And again, thank you to everyone for the time. Assalamu alaikum.
I would just say that there's so much opportunity right now. Like crisis sometimes can be really scary, but there's always opportunity within crisis as well. And I think this pandemic has reset a lot of things around us, right? The importance of public spaces and especially nature when the weather is warm, the importance of really our families and our communities and our bodies and our health, right? All of this, there are certain things that have been reset around accessibility for spaces, right? The fact that there are captions being provided for this space, right? Like there's certain practices that have been opened up because of this pandemic, where before showing up in person, right, was the standard. And right now there's that accessibility that's happening for people who are disabled or don't have transportation or whatever other reason, right? So really being able to lean into that and recognizing the places that we can disrupt and create like a better world together is really important. I think in terms of specific things, this is an opportunity to really think about, the spaces that you're attending. I often ask people, like, your social media is one space that you can completely curate, to your heart's content. So what voices are you listening to on social media? Do you have representation? Do you have different people across different lines of identity, right, that you're absorbing their content on a regular basis? And what content are you putting out there? Because it's very important to see that as well. And then I would say that process of unlearning and relearning, there's so much tied to that. So especially 2 resources that I'm going to mention. One is Muslim Arc, so muslimarc.org. You can book a training, you can become a member, you can donate, right? And there's a fellowship process that has just been kicked off for new trainers to come in to donate to support that effort, right? And then the other resource would be the Detroit Equity Action Lab. So we've mentioned Detroit a number of times today, and there's a lot of, for people who are, out in the suburbs, right, or who do not know as much about kind of what's happening in Detroit. Mark mentioned Detroit being a canary in a coal mine, and it's so true. Some of the stuff that happens here then happens in other places, right? And Detroit Equity Action Lab is a really great resource. So you can find, social media updates, toolkits, all kinds of information. There's a fellowship program that just kicked off for year 6, and there's some really great resources on there. So I'd really encourage people to educate and support efforts that they value.
I'd like to just add, I don't have any plugs, unfortunately, unless you want to learn more about the City Council office. So yeah, Google us, Detroit City Council. You can watch formal committees on Tuesdays. If you need some entertainment, make sure to bring some popcorn. Yeah, I mean, I think at this point, I'd like, if you live in the city, get to know who your city council members are, get to know who your representatives are. In general, I think, the one thing, the least that folks can do is engage their representatives, be it on a state level or local level. I think local politics is one of the most important, politics there is in a country like the United States. Sorry, you guys, I think this is like my 10th meeting of the day. So the fact that I'm running on some Adani chai and I'm still alive. So yes, but essentially, yes, stay politically engaged with your representatives. You don't have to be an organizer. I tell these to folks, if you walk away from this conversation, it's just, you are perfect the way that you are. Keep doing, pursuing whatever area that you are interested in, but, try to learn, try to listen, plug into what already exists, hold your representatives accountable. And then I think something else on a personal level, I think this pandemic and quarantine I acknowledge that it has been very difficult for many people. But at the same time, I think in a way, it has allowed us to return to some level of normalcy, and I think that's my sort of approach to this entire phase, is that we have been allowed to kind of connect back to our humanity a little bit, right? Build our close relationships, take care of ourselves, take care of our communities. And I think if we continue to do that and we make use of the time that we have working from home, although it is difficult, I acknowledge that. I think there's more room for growth, but yeah, your personal well-being, your community well-being, your family's well-being, I think it's allowing us to ground ourselves and to build that foundation once again, to recenter our work, recenter our values, and I think that allows us to continue and to wake up the next day and continue the work. So yeah, that's my final thoughts. Thank you so much for hosting and for everything that Halal Metropolis has been able to achieve thus far.
Hanan, Namira, Brother Mark, I want to thank you for joining us today and contributing to such an important and inspiring conversation. And inshallah, we'll be able to do this again. So thank you for joining us. And then for those of who joined us live, thank you, and thank you for your questions. These videos are recorded and will be uploaded to Facebook and YouTube, so please check them out if you couldn't attend any of the events. Learn more about our project, and for those that missed our Dearborn exhibit, you can visit it virtually on our website at halalmetropolis.org. Our turn to plug. Our exhibition series will be continuing this May at the Stamps Gallery at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And please also check out our ongoing Zoom in to the Halal Metropolis series that explores how the Muslim community is coping with the COVID-19 pandemic. We also look forward to having you join us next Thursday for our next gallery talk, where we will be joined by Zain Maki, Ali Husseiki, and Mirna Hamad, who will literally be giving us some food for thought as they talk about innovations in the halal food scene. And please remember to follow us on social media to get notified and stay updated on news and events about the project. Wishing you all safety and health. Assalamu alaikum.